My husband just threw me out. Can I sleep here, please?
The engine noise came first, low, uneven, familiar. He heard it before he saw the headlights crawl up the gravel road that cut through the ranch like a scar. It was late, past the hour when even the wind seemed to slow down, and he had already washed the grease from his hands and tucked his son into bed. The ranch mechanic's house was small, practical, built for function more than comfort. He didn't expect company, especially not at this hour. When the car stopped abruptly near the fence line, instead of continuing on, something in his chest tightened. He stepped onto the porch, the yellow light above his door casting long shadows on the ground. That's when he saw her, standing beside the car, coat thrown over thin night clothes, arms wrapped tightly around herself like she was trying to keep something inside from breaking apart. She hadn't planned to drive this far. She hadn't planned anything at all. One moment she had been standing in her kitchen, the next she was being shouted at, accused of things that didn't make sense, told to leave now. No explanation, no argument allowed, just the door opening, then closing behind her like a verdict. The cold night swallowed her whole as she stumbled into the car with shaking hands. She drove without direction until the familiar outline of the ranch appeared in the dark. She remembered the quiet black man who lived across from their property, the mechanic who fixed engines with patience and never spoke more than necessary. She barely knew him, but she knew he was kind. And right now, kindness felt like survival. He approached slowly, careful not to startle her. Years of living cautiously had taught him that sudden movements carried consequences, especially at night. "Ma'am," he said gently, voice low and steady. She looked up at him then, eyes red, breath uneven, pride already exhausted. For a second, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken boundaries. Race, reputation, time of night, town rules that didn't need to be written down. Finally, her voice broke through. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't know where else to go." He didn't ask questions. He didn't look around to see who might be watching. He just nodded once and stepped aside. "You're safe here," he said. And for the first time since the door slammed behind her, she believed it. Inside, the house smelled faintly of oil, soap, and something warm that had been cooked earlier. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't curated. But it felt real. He offered her a seat, then a blanket, then space. His son slept in the next room, unaware that something fragile had just crossed their threshold. She sat stiffly on the edge of the couch, hands clenched, replaying the night in her head, trying to make sense of how her life had unraveled so quickly. He stood near the doorway, keeping distance, understanding the weight of what this moment could become if mishandled. In this town, stories didn't wait for truth. But tonight, truth mattered more than fear. Outside, the ranch lay quiet under the stars, fences stretching endlessly, witnesses to things that never made the papers. Inside, two strangers sat on opposite sides of a room, both carrying burdens they hadn't asked for. Neither of them knew it yet, but this night, this unplanned collision of loss and restraint would change the shape of their lives. Not loudly, not easily, but slowly, in the way that only real healing ever does. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, because this story might sound familiar, but it won't feel the same.
Thank you for watching thus far.
Please subscribe to Black Story Tales.
Morning didn't arrive gently for Ella. It crept in through the thin curtains like an uninvited witness, illuminating a room that still smelled faintly of engine oil and strong soap. She woke on the couch with the blanket pulled up to her chin, stiff and disoriented, her body unsure whether it was safe to relax. For a brief, terrifying moment, she forgot where she was, and then memory rushed back all at once. The shouting, the door, the cold night air burning her lungs. She sat up quickly, heart racing, half expecting to be told she had overstayed her welcome. Instead, she heard quiet movement from the kitchen, the soft clink of a mug, the hum of an old refrigerator. Normal sounds, grounding sounds, sounds that told her she hadn't imagined the kindness of the night before. Richard had been awake for an hour already. He always was. Habit had shaped his life more than choice. He stood at the counter fixing a simple breakfast, mindful of keeping the noise down. His son was still asleep, curled beneath a superhero blanket in the next room. Richard hadn't slept much himself, not because Ella was there, but because he understood exactly what her presence meant. In a town like this, nothing stayed private for long. A white woman spending the night in a black man's house, even under innocent circumstances, could become something ugly if twisted by the wrong mouths. Still, when he heard her footsteps hesitating in the hallway, his first instinct wasn't fear. It was care. He turned slightly, giving her space. "Morning," he said softly, as if they were already familiar with each other. She hovered near the doorway, arms crossed, her face tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. "I'm sorry," she said immediately, the words tumbling out like she'd been rehearsing them in her head. "I didn't mean to cause trouble. Her voice cracked, and she stopped. Richard shook his head gently. "You didn't cause anything," he replied. "You needed somewhere safe." He poured her a cup of coffee without asking, sliding it across the counter like it was the most natural thing in the world. That small act, unassuming, wordless, hit her harder than anything else. She wrapped her hands around the mug, letting the warmth steady her shaking fingers. For the first time since the night before, she exhaled fully. They sat at opposite ends of the small kitchen table, the distance deliberate, respectful. Ella stared into her coffee for a long moment before speaking again. "He told me to leave," she said quietly. No explanation, no argument. Just go. Saying it out loud made it real in a way it hadn't been yet. Richard listened without interrupting, his posture still, his attention complete. He had learned long ago that people didn't need fixing in moments like this. They needed to be heard. "I didn't even have shoes on at first," she continued, embarrassment creeping into her tone. "I grabbed whatever I could and drove. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now." The question lingered, heavy with fear and uncertainty. Richard leaned back slightly, choosing his words with care. "You don't have to figure everything out today," he said. "Right now, you just need rest and a plan that keeps you safe." She nodded, tears gathering again, frustration and gratitude tangled together. It was then she finally looked at him, really looked at him. The grease-stained work shirt folded neatly over the chair, the tired lines around his eyes, the quiet strength that didn't ask to be admired. She realized how much she was asking without having asked yet. "Can I stay?" she said finally, voice barely above a whisper. "Just for a little while? Until I figure things out." The request felt enormous, unpracticed, fragile. Richard didn't answer immediately. He thought of his son, of the town, of church pews and sideways glances, of how easily kindness could be misunderstood. He also thought of the woman sitting across from him, holding herself together with the last threads of pride she had left. "You can stay," he said at last. "Short term. We'll keep it proper. My son comes first, and so does your dignity." Relief washed over her so visibly that it startled her. She nodded quickly, tears finally spilling over. "Thank you," she whispered. Outside, the ranch stretched on, quiet and watchful. Inside, an agreement had been made, not just to share space, but to protect one another in a world that rarely offered grace without condition. By the third morning, the house had settled into a careful rhythm. Not comfortable, careful. Ella woke early, always before Richard's son stirred, folding the blanket exactly the way she'd found it, wiping down surfaces she hadn't dirted, trying to leave as little evidence of herself as possible. She moved through the space like a guest who understood that her welcome depended on respect. The mechanic's house was modest, practical, shaped by years of responsibility rather than indulgence. Family photos lined one wall, Richard with his son at different ages, birthdays marked by simple cakes and wide smiles. There was no sign of a woman. That absence spoke louder than explanations. Ella felt it deeply, the quiet proof that she wasn't the only one carrying loss, even if theirs were different faces. Richard noticed everything, though he pretended not to. He noticed how she stayed to one side of the room when his son was present, how she spoke gently, how she never overstepped. He noticed the way his boy warmed to her naturally, asking simple questions, accepting her presence without suspicion. Children didn't carry the weight of town rules yet. That responsibility belonged to adults. Richard set boundaries early, not harshly, but firmly. Meals were shared, doors stayed open, evenings ended early. He explained these rules without apology. Ella understood immediately. She didn't argue. She was too aware of how fragile her situation was, and how much was at stake for him. The town, however, had begun to notice. Ranches were not places where things went unseen. A car parked longer than usual. Curtains opening at different hours. A woman walking out onto Richard's porch in the early morning light. At the feed store, a glance lingered too long. At the mechanic's bay, a joke landed awkwardly and wasn't laughed at. Richard felt the shift before it ever reached his ears. He had lived his whole life reading rooms like weather patterns, sensing when storms were forming long before thunder sounded. He kept his head down, his work flawless, his interactions brief. Reputation, he knew, was a currency easily spent and rarely recovered. Ella felt it too, though it came wrapped in politeness. A woman from church stopped by with a casserole, eyes darting past Ella into the house as if taking inventory. "We didn't know you had company," she said lightly, the words coated in concern but sharpened by curiosity. Ella smiled, thanked her, said nothing more. Later that night, she cried quietly in the bathroom, ashamed of how quickly fear had returned. She hadn't done anything wrong, and yet, she felt wrong for simply existing in this space. That realization hurt more than the night she'd been thrown out. It reminded her how easily safety could become conditional. That evening, Richard found her sitting on the back steps, staring out at the wide stretch of land as the sun dipped low. He didn't ask what was wrong. He sat beside her, leaving space between them, the way he always did. "People talk," he said calmly, not accusing, not bitter, just honest. She nodded. "I know," she replied. "I don't want to make your life harder." He looked at the horizon, then back at her. "You're not," he said, "but we have to be smart." In that moment, something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that staying wasn't just about shelter. It was about navigating a world that would test their restraint at every turn. By the end of the first week, the ranch no longer felt neutral. It felt observant. Every gate Richard repaired, every engine he leaned over, came with the faint awareness that he was being measured. Not officially, not in any way that could be written down, but in the subtle ways people monitored deviation. A coworker asked casually how things were at home. Another mentioned, almost jokingly, that ranch houses weren't meant for unexpected arrangements. Richard responded the way he always did, calm, respectful, brief. He let his work speak for him. Still, he could feel the pressure tightening, the unspoken reminder that his life was not his alone to define. He had a son to protect, a job that kept food on the table, and a town that believed order depended on everyone staying where they were expected to stay. Ella experienced the scrutiny more personally. She limited her movements, choosing early mornings or late afternoons when fewer people were around. When she did leave the house, she kept her head down, her presence modest. Pride had taught her to survive in polished spaces. This was different. This was survival stripped of comfort. Her phone buzzed with messages from family she hadn't yet answered, each one another reminder that explanations were expected of her. "Why didn't you come home? Where are you staying? What kind of situation is this?" She knew how it sounded before she ever said it out loud, and that knowledge weighed on her more heavily than the cold night that had driven her here. Church arrived like a reckoning. Richard debated whether to go that Sunday, knowing absence could speak as loudly as presence. In the end, he went, for his son. They sat near the back, as usual. Ella arrived separately, slipping into a pew on the opposite side, her heart pounding harder than it had the night she knocked on his door. The service felt longer than usual. The sermon touched on propriety, on wisdom in difficult seasons. No names were mentioned. None were needed. Ella felt heat rise in her face, shame trying to take root where grief already lived. Richard sat still, his expression unchanged, but inside he felt the familiar anger, the quiet kind that came from being spoken about without ever being spoken to. After service, the separation became harder to maintain. Eyes followed them both. Conversations stalled when they passed. A woman from the church stopped Ella near the door, voice soft but pointed. "You should really consider going back to your family," she said. "This town can be complicated." Ella nodded politely, but the words landed like dismissal. Outside, Richard waited near his truck, his son tugging at his sleeve. When Ella walked past, their eyes met briefly. No smile, no greeting, just acknowledgement. In that small moment, both of them felt the cost of staying invisible. Distance was protecting them, but it was also wounding them. That night, after his son was asleep, Richard sat at the kitchen table long after the house went quiet. He thought about rules, spoken and unspoken, and how often they were designed to test the endurance of people like him. He thought about Ella, alone in the next room, carrying shame she didn't deserve. And for the first time, he questioned whether caution alone was enough. Across the hall, Ella lay awake staring at the ceiling, realizing something equally unsettling. Safety without dignity was not sustainable. If she stayed, it couldn't be as a secret. And if she left, it couldn't be because fear forced her out again. If this chapter resonates with you, pause for a moment and comment where you're watching from. And if you've ever felt judged for choosing survival over appearances, stay with this story, because what comes next will test everything they've been trying to protect. The tension did not explode the way Ella expected it to. It seeped instead, slow, persistent, finding its way into corners of daily life that once felt ordinary. Richard noticed it most in his son. The boy had begun asking questions carefully, the way children do when they sense adults are carrying something heavy. "Is Miss Ella staying long?" he asked one evening, not looking up from his homework. Richard paused, choosing honesty without burden. "She's staying until she gets back on her feet," he said. The answer seemed to satisfy him, but Richard felt the weight of it settle anyway. Children didn't need all the details, but they felt instability before it was named. That night, after his son fell asleep, Richard sat alone, realizing that avoiding decisions was becoming its own decision, and not a harmless one. Ella felt the pressure peak when her family finally showed up unannounced. Her sister's car pulled into the dirt drive just before sunset, dust rising behind it like a warning. Ella froze at the window, her chest tightening. She hadn't told them where she was. She hadn't been ready. Richard saw the fear cross her face and understood immediately. He didn't offer to hide her. He didn't take control. He simply asked, "Do you want me here?" She nodded, relief flooding her eyes. When her sister stepped inside, her gaze swept the room quickly, taking in the modest furniture, the photos on the wall, the child's shoes by the door. The judgment was quiet but unmistakable. "This is where you've been?" she asked. Ella stood straighter than she felt. "Yes," she replied. "I was thrown out at night. I needed somewhere safe." The truth sat between them, heavy and undeniable. The conversation that followed was restrained but sharp. Her sister spoke of appearances, of how things would look once people found out. She spoke of race without saying the word, of complications and optics. Richard remained present but silent, his posture calm, his voice unused. When Ella finally said, "I wasn't safe where I was," something shifted. Silence fell. No one argued with that. Her sister softened, not fully, but enough to recognize that this situation wasn't reckless rebellion. It was survival. She left with unresolved concern, but no ultimatum. After the door closed, Ella sank onto the couch, shaking. Richard handed her a glass of water, his hand steady. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said. This time, she believed him a little more. The town responded the only way it knew how, by solidifying opinions. Some people withdrew politely. Others grew warmer, almost protective, once the story began to make sense. At the ranch, a coworker quietly told Richard, "My sister went through something like that. You're doing right." It wasn't public approval, but it mattered. At church, the whispers didn't vanish, but they changed tone. Less scandal, more discomfort. Ella began to understand that staying silent had allowed others to control the narrative. Doing nothing had given fear room to grow. The realization was both freeing and frightening. If they were going to be judged regardless, perhaps honesty was the safer choice. That evening, Ella and Richard talked longer than they ever had. Not about romance, not about the future, about boundaries, about timing, about what dignity meant when survival was involved. Ella admitted she didn't want to feel like a secret anymore. Richard admitted he didn't want his son learning that kindness should be hidden. They didn't resolve everything, but something important happened. They agreed that fear would no longer be the loudest voice in the room. Outside, the ranch lay quiet under a deepening sky, unchanged by human tension. Inside, two people recognized that standing still had a cost, and that moving forward, carefully and visibly, might be the braver choice. The first change was small, almost unnoticeable to anyone who wasn't looking closely. Ella stopped waking before dawn to move through the house unseen. She brewed coffee in the morning while Richard prepared his son for school, the sound of ordinary life filling the space where tension had once lived. There was still caution in her movements, still awareness of how easily stories could be twisted, but fear no longer dictated every step. She began taking short walks along the edge of the ranch in full daylight, shoulders squared, reminding herself that survival didn't have to look like shame. Each step felt like a quiet declaration. I am allowed to exist without apology. Richard felt the shift in himself as well. He stopped taking the longest routes around the ranch just to avoid being seen near the house. At work, he answered questions plainly, without volunteering information but without evasion either. She needed somewhere safe, he said once, meeting a co-worker's eye steadily. The man nodded and changed the subject. It wasn't approval, but it wasn't resistance either. That mattered. Richard understood that courage didn't always arrive as a dramatic stand. Sometimes it came as consistency, showing up the same way every day until fear lost its grip. Their decision to attend church openly together wasn't announced. It simply happened. One Sunday morning, Ella stood at the door uncertain, smoothing the front of her dress as if preparing for judgment. Richard waited, keys in hand, his son bouncing impatiently beside him. "Ready?" he asked, not pushing, not rushing. She nodded. Walking into the church side by side felt heavier than she expected. Heads turned. Conversations paused. But no one stopped them. They took a seat near the back, leaving space between themselves and others, their presence quiet but undeniable. During the service, Ella focused on her breathing. Richard focused on his son. The sermon passed without incident. And when it ended, something unexpected happened. Nothing. No confrontation. No public correction. Just life continuing. The town reacted slowly, as towns do. Some people chose distance. Others adjusted. A woman from church offered Ella a hymn book with a small smile. A man at the ranch thanked Richard for staying late to help with a stubborn engine. These moments were not declarations of support, but they were acknowledgments. Proof that visibility did not automatically invite destruction. That dignity, when held calmly, could reshape the way people responded. Ella began to feel something unfamiliar returning, a sense of self not defined by what had been taken from her. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in gold, Ella and Richard sat on the porch steps, not speaking. There was comfort in the silence now, not the tense quiet of restraint, but the settled kind that came after truth had been spoken. "Thank you," Ella said finally, "for not making me feel like I was a problem to solve." Richard nodded, eyes on the horizon. "You're not," he replied. "You're someone passing through a hard season." In that moment, neither of them knew exactly what the future would hold. But they knew this much: stepping into daylight hadn't broken them. It had made room for healing, for honesty, and for whatever came next. The knock came just after dusk, sharp and insistent, cutting through the calm that had finally begun to settle. Richard felt it before he heard it, a tightening in his chest that warned him this moment would not be simple. Ella was in the kitchen, rinsing dishes, when the sound froze her in place. She knew that knock. Her body remembered it before her mind could catch up. Richard met her eyes across the room, reading the fear there without a word. "Do you want me to handle it?" he asked quietly. She swallowed hard, then nodded. Some encounters, she had learned, required steadiness more than explanation. When Richard opened the door, Ella's husband stood on the porch, anger poorly disguised as authority. His voice was loud enough to carry, his posture aggressive in a way meant to reclaim control. "She needs to come home," he said, eyes flicking past Richard into the house. "This has gone far enough." Richard didn't raise his voice. He didn't move aside. He stood solid, unmoved. "She left because she wasn't safe," he replied calmly. "You don't get to demand anything here." The words were measured, but they landed with weight. Ella's husband scoffed, muttering about misunderstandings, about embarrassment, about how things looked. What he didn't say mattered more. There was no apology, no concern, only possession. Ella stepped forward then, her hands trembling but her voice clear. "I'm not coming back," she said. "Not like this." Saying it out loud felt like stepping off a ledge, terrifying and necessary. Her husband turned to her sharply, surprise flashing across his face at her resolve. He tried to soften his tone, to rewrite the story now that he realized control was slipping. But it was too late. The night air carried too many witnesses: neighbors' porch lights, passing headlights, the undeniable presence of Richard standing firm beside her. After a long moment, her husband backed away, frustration etched deep, and left with a warning that sounded more hollow than threatening. After the car disappeared down the road, the silence returned, thick but different. Ella's knees buckled slightly, adrenaline giving way to exhaustion. Richard closed the door and turned to her, concern etched across his face. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded slowly, tears spilling free now that she no longer had to hold them back. "I think," she said shakily. "That was the first time I chose myself out loud." The realization stunned her. All this time, she had been surviving quietly. Tonight, she had stood. The town would talk, of course. They always did. But something had shifted irreversibly. Boundaries had been drawn in daylight, not whispered in fear. Richard knew there might be consequences. Raised eyebrows at work, tighter scrutiny at church. But he also knew this. His son had watched him stand up for what was right without violence or spectacle. Ella had watched herself refuse to return to harm simply to satisfy appearances. As they sat together later that night, the porch light glowing softly. Neither of them spoke of love or future plans. They didn't need to. What mattered was simpler and stronger. They had faced the past, and it no longer had the final say. In the days that followed the confrontation, the ranch seemed to exhale. Not because trouble had vanished, but because truth had finally been spoken where fear once lived. Ella moved through the house with a steadier rhythm, no longer bracing herself at every sound. She began making plans that extended beyond the next hour, calling a lawyer recommended quietly by a church member, opening a new bank account, gathering documents she had left behind. Each small step returned a piece of herself she hadn't realized she'd surrendered. Healing, she discovered, wasn't dramatic. It was practical. It looked like paperwork and phone calls and choosing not to flinch when the past tried to knock again. Richard felt healing in different ways. He noticed how his shoulders no longer stayed tense when he walked onto the ranch each morning. The work was the same. Engines to fix, tools to clean, long days under the sun, but his posture had changed. He stood straighter, spoke plainly, and no longer felt the need to explain his integrity before it was questioned. A supervisor pulled him aside one afternoon, not to warn him, but to thank him for staying late during a breakdown that could have cost the ranch a fortune. It wasn't a grand endorsement, but it was respect earned without compromise. At home, his son asked fewer worried questions and more curious ones about engines, about school projects, about whether Ella would help him bake again. Church adjusted too, slowly and imperfectly. Ella attended regularly now, sitting with Richard and his son without apology. Some people avoided her eyes. Others offered small kindnesses that meant more than speeches: a seat saved, a quiet prayer, a warm smile. The sermons moved on to other topics, and with time, the congregation's attention followed. What lingered wasn't scandal, but a cautious admiration. People recognized courage when they saw it, even if it challenged their comfort. Ella felt something unfamiliar bloom during worship one Sunday: peace. Not the fragile kind that depended on approval, but the solid kind that came from alignment between her choices and her worth. Their relationship remained careful, grounded in mutual respect rather than urgency. They talked openly about boundaries, about timing, about the difference between comfort and dependence. Richard never positioned himself as a rescuer. Ella never leaned on him as an escape. They shared meals, conversations, laughter, and silence, each chosen, none assumed. On evenings when the sky turned amber over the fields, they sat on the porch and spoke about ordinary dreams: a bigger tool shed, a small garden, a future that didn't require hiding. Healing, they learned, allowed room for hope without demanding certainty. By the time the first cold nights arrived, the ranch felt like a place of belonging again, not just for Richard and his son, but for Ella too. She wasn't invisible anymore, nor was she exposed. She was simply present. And in that presence, something profound took root. The understanding that dignity survives storms, that kindness can withstand scrutiny, and that when truth is lived out loud, it creates space for a life that doesn't have to be explained. The season changed quietly, the way meaningful things often do. The ranch settled into cooler mornings and softer evenings, and with them came a sense of completion neither Ella nor Richard had rushed to name. Ella no longer lived out of uncertainty. She had secured a small place of her own not far from the ranch. Temporary, modest, but hers. She still spent time at Richard's house, still shared meals and conversations, but now it was by choice, not necessity. That distinction mattered. It marked the difference between refuge and freedom. She walked differently now, head lifted, steps sure, no longer shaped by fear of being displaced again. Richard watched this change with quiet pride. He had never wanted to be the reason Ella stayed stuck. Seeing her regain control of her life affirmed what he believed all along: that support should strengthen, not replace. His son adjusted easily, proud in the way children are when adults handle things with honesty. The house felt lighter. Laughter returned without effort. At the ranch, work continued as it always had, but Richard's presence carried new respect, not because he had explained himself, but because he had remained consistent when it mattered most. Their connection deepened naturally, without pressure. They didn't announce a relationship. They didn't rush into promises. What they shared was built on something sturdier than urgency: mutual regard, patience, and the shared understanding of what it meant to survive and still choose kindness. When they did walk together through town or sit side by side at church, it felt unremarkable in the best way. Familiar, earned. The town had moved on, as towns always do, But what remained was something quieter and more lasting. Acceptance shaped by time and truth. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields gold, Ella stood beside Richard at the fence line, watching his son run ahead, carefree. "Thank you," she said softly, "not for shelter alone, but for dignity." Richard nodded, understanding without needing it spelled out. They stood there in comfortable silence, the kind that comes after storms have passed and the ground has settled. Not everything was perfect. Life rarely was, but it was honest, and that was enough. Moral of the story: sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is offer kindness when the world is watching, and accept it without shame when you need it most. Healing doesn't come from hiding, and dignity doesn't come from approval. That it comes from choosing truth, patience, and compassion, one quiet decision at a time. If this story moved you, comment where you're watching from and share it with someone who needs to be reminded. Survival is not weakness, and kindness is never a mistake. This is Black Story Tales, where real strength lives in quiet moments.
Thank you for watching.
Please subscribe.